Hello and welcome to number 13 of our Learn to Draft series, where we will talk about advanced deck building. Note that despite this name, this guide is also applicable for constructed, so if I wanted to build a constructed deck, this would also be my approach. And also note that we have postponed the region identities of the other 4 missing regions until we have all of the champions, or at least the Ben City versions of these champions, but those will be delivered afterwards. I want to separate this video into 3 parts for beginner, intermediate, and expert, because this game is just like League of Legends, for example, where you first have to learn the fundamentals and then you can learn more advanced stuff. If you had a new player who doesn't even know anything about like what is the objective of the game or what does every champion do, it wouldn't be very helpful to talk with him about split pushing or stuff like that, if you stay in our league example. So this video will be split into like 3 minor segments, and there are timestamps in the description, so you can skip ahead if you already know a concept. As beginners, we want to talk about the mid-range curve once more and about vanilla test. Did that already, so this will be a little bit more short. Intermediates will talk about game plan and advanced curves. This will be the focus of this video. And for the experts, we have meta considerations and then bucket shaping, which will be a separate video because I get asked about this one a lot. So I wanted this to be a little bit separate from the normal stuff, so other people who want to just see bucket shaping don't have to watch like 1 hour of a video before that. Let's start with the beginners. So if you're just starting out Legends of Runeterra expeditions, maybe just binge watch my videos to get better at it, then this is the segment for you. First of all, you should try to get one of these 3 regions. Noxus, Demacia, and Ben City are the regions with the best stats and where you can just play a good curve and don't have to worry too much about what your opponent's doing, what your cards are doing. To a lesser degree, Shurima, Targon, and Freljord also work. I would suggest you to stay away from the other 4 for now, since they are harder to play and more complicated to play. You should always try to aim for a mid-range deck, and I typically like the split 26 units, 10 spells. If you're just starting out, you want to have more units to play, and for your unit curve, don't look at this ever. This is just not useful at all because it doesn't even separate between units and spells. This just is always incorrect. You want to look yourself at your unit count and maybe you just write it down or just count it in your head, each pick you do. Or I'd, for example, use like dice and put dice down to see how many of each curve I have. And you want like a good starting point would be 3 1-drops, 7 2-drops. 2-drops are the most flexible card you can have in your deck because you can play 2 2-drops on turn 4 or a 2-drop and a 3-drop on turn 5. Then 6 3-drops, 4 4-drops, 4 5-drops, and 2 6-drops on average, which will add up to 26 units. Of course, you don't have to have this exact curve. This is just a guideline for what deck you usually should go for. And count these spells that summon a unit as units, not spells. For example, Succession should go in the 3-cost slot, despite actually being a spell. And my first tip would be to be proactive. It's way easier to be proactive than to be reactive, because if you want to be reactive, you have to first know what your opponent can do, and it's way easier to just find it out yourself by being proactive. This is similar to limit testing in League of Legends, where you just go in, just fight, and find out what you lose to. My first attempt when I started playing was Noxus. I just drafted Noxus over and over again, and especially this curve, 1 mana 3/2, 2 mana 5/1, 3 mana 5/4. And then I just forced my opponents to beat this. And most people didn't have any plan, they just played random stuff and just lost. And then against the people I lost, for example, who played like an Avalanche or something, then I learned, aha, this beats my strategy. And then I slowly but surely learned all of the cards. This would be my tip. Even for constructed, just play spider aggro, for example, until you have a good grasp of what all the cards do, or what most cards do, and understand what the other deck's strategies are, how can they deal with your fast start. I want to also repeat the vanilla test, so if you want to see what card is good, is this card good, is this card bad? And this goes for almost every card game, no matter if it's Hearthstone or MTG, for example. You want to have this vanilla test. For 1 mana, you want to get a 2-1, for 2 mana, a 2-3, 3-2, and then from 3 on forward, 3-3, 4-4, 5-5, 6-6, 7-7, 8-8, 9-9, etc. So if you're getting significantly less than this stats, then it's a bad card. If you're getting significantly more than this, it's a very good card. And if it's on par, it's like an average card. And I often got asked, since I made this first video, how do you factor in keywords? And keywords are of course a little bit hard to factor in, since a keyword has different effect depending on the unit it is on. But as just a very basic rule, you can, for example, take Challenger. This is an offensive keyword. It does something when you attack. So you just give the unit +1/+0. Fury is a defensive keyword. It helps your unit survive more. So just give it +0/+1. So you will end up with a 5-6 and a good card, because it's more than a 5-5. Let's look at another example. This one also has 2 keywords. Lifesteal is defensive, gives you more life, so 1 extra health. Spell Shield also is defensive, gives you 1 extra life. So we would end up with a 1-4. And if you remember, we want a 3-3, not a 1-4. So this card is a bad card. Again, this is very, very simplified. But if you're just starting out, this is a good way to approach any card game format whatsoever. Generating your random card is usually worth 1 mana. For example, here a 1-3 is similar to a 2-1. So it would be worth 1 mana, but the random card makes it 2 mana, which is okay. And a draw effect is usually worth 1.5 mana. More like 2 mana in the early game and 1 mana in the later game. So I would just average it out at 1.5 mana. So just try to pick your good curve and pick good cards. And from that point onward, just try to build a decent mid-range deck with the curve I showed you. And you will immediately see more success in these games. Just be proactive. Don't worry too much about what your opponent is doing. Just make your opponent react to you and will see immediate success. Another rule I have is pick 2 medium cards over 1 good and 1 bad card. This makes your deck less draw dependent. Okay, let's move on to the intermediates. As an intermediate player, you have played at least 100 expedition games and have a basic knowledge of all the cards. So you know what an avalanche is, for example, you know what Whirling Death does, you know what a single combat is. You have a basic idea of what all the cards do in the game. At this point, you should have a game plan in mind while drafting. So you shouldn't just go into the draft and be like, oh, we will pick good cards and just see what will happen. Because like other formats, for example MTG, just picking the best card is usually the best strategy. In Legends of Runeterra, you get rewarded if you try to draft for a synergy a little bit more. Just having a game plan in mind will help you with that. And each champion has an intended curve. So each champion wants to be played in a specific way, and the followers of this champion, the support cards, and also the buckets are built around this intended curve. So champion doesn't just exist in a vacuum, but always comes with support, with a certain best strategy to be played with. Let's take a look at the most popular deck, the Pantheon deck in Constructed, for that example. If you take a look at this deck, it might seem pretty obvious what the best possible game plan is. You have a 1-drop, a 2-drop, a 3-drop, and a 4-drop, right? So you would say maybe the best strategy is just to curve out 1, 2, 3, 4. But in most of the champions' designs, it's actually not that easy. And if you go 1, 2, 3, 4 with the Pantheon deck, you kinda misplay and play the deck wrong. Because at the end of the day, with this curve, your Pantheon will just be a 1 out of 5 on turn 4. Instead, the intended curve of Pantheon, or one of the better curves of Pantheon, of course you can like adapt to your opponent's strategies. One of the better curves would be to turn 1 pass, and then play out your Saga Seeker. This allows you to have Nightfall activated for your Pale Cascade, and you immediately get 1 Fated Trigger. Then you play your Brightsteel Protector on turn 3, while also banking 1 spell mana. Then you play on turn 4 the Wounded White Flame, uses 1 spell mana and the 1 remaining mana for a 2 mana combat trick or any other spell, single combat for example. And in this way, you will already have your Pantheon advanced by 3 out of 5. So you will already be way farther with your actual game plan of leveling a Pantheon than if you would have just gone for the curve out. Then on turn 4, you can play your, or turn 5, you can play your Pantheon, and with 1 mana left over, play a Chain Vest on him. This would mean he's at 4 out of 5, and then any spell would lead to a turn 6 level up. So most champions, or almost all champions, have a specific way that they should be played, and a specific lineup you want to have if you want to play the champion as optimal as possible. And this always comes with time. That's why this is an intermediate part. You could either look at guides online or other players, how they draft this champion. Maybe look at constructed decks if you're in expeditions, because most of the expeditions buckets are built around constructed. And you should just have such a general game plan in mind after you pick your champion, when you head into the draft. Let's do an expeditions example here. The best champion right now would be Shyvana. And the intended curve for Shyvana is Dragon Chow, Dragon Guard Lieutenant, Ruined Dragon Guard, and Screeching Dragon. So this would be a classic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Way simpler than the best possible Pantheon curve. And of course, this is also in one region only. If you go into other regions like Targon, for example, you can have different curves. But for simplicity's sake, let's just stay in Demacia and say this is the best Demacia Dragon curve you can have. Why is this curve so good? The Shyvana on play will strike the Chow. This will lead to her having a 3 out of 12 and getting 2 stacks from the Ruined Dragon Guard. And on the attack, this will turn her into a 6/7 and deal 6 damage, so she will go to 9 out of 12. And as soon as the Screeching Dragon strikes, next combat, Shyvana will then be leveled up, and this is pretty much the fastest way to level up Shyvana. Except for some ridiculous stuff like 4 Dragon Chows, for example, but on average, this is one of the fastest ways to level up Shyvana. And once Shyvana is leveled up, she's just a very strong champion. Okay, once you have your basic game plan in mind, I want to play Shyvana, I want to level her up, and this would be my perfect curve. You think about what card is very important for this game plan. So the first important card would be Dragon Chow. Without Dragon Chow, you would delay this 1 turn. And the second important card would be Screeching Dragon, because Screeching Dragon is also needed for this level up. Could replace it with other dragons, but Screeching Dragon is the only 5-cost dragon in Demacia. And then you would look at these cards and think about which card is only good if I draw this perfect curve, and which card is generally good. Because you are playing expeditions, you won't always have this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 start. And you will still want to look out for having generally good cards and not too many synergy cards. So the vanilla test rule still applies. If you go by vanilla test, this Dragon Chow would only be good for synergy. So it's not really a good card. We don't want 7 Dragon Chows in our deck because Dragon Chow on its own is not good. It's purely a combo card. Dragon Guard Lieutenant would be always okay, whereas Ruined Dragon Guard, already a 3/4, would be pretty good here. And Screeching Dragon, as discussed before, would also be always good. And you notice that one card is essential to our strategy and is also always good. So this is where our saying comes, see a Screeching Dragon, pick a Screeching Dragon. Because it's not only a good synergy card, but it's also always good. For example, I would be more hesitant to pick Dragon Chow, because it's only good as synergy, but not good independently. And you have to have good independent cards in expeditions. Whereas Screeching Dragon will be good by himself, and even better if you combine him with Shyvana. So in my head, when I pick up Shyvana, I already have locked in, I want to pick up every Screeching Dragon possible along the draft. Right? My 5-drop slot should be 6 to 7 to 8 Screeching Dragons, if possible. Because that's the perfect card, and it's also always good. So again, my mindset is now, picked up Shyvana, first pick, I want to build around Shyvana, I want to pick up every Screeching Dragon I have. From that point, you can draw conclusions. You can say, okay, if I want to have 6, 7, 8 Screeching Dragons in my deck, I don't want any other random 5-drops in my deck. So while Great Companion and Garen are usually good, they would actively make my game plan worse or would be redundant, since too many 5-drops are not good. I want my 5-drop slot to be Screeching Dragon, and not these other random cards. So when I draft Shyvana, the Greater Companion and Garen would have a way less value for my deck building concept than if I would draft, for example, around Garen or around MF. And in MF, for example, this 5-drop would be pretty good, but not in our game plan. So I would try to avoid Greater Companion, and I would try to avoid Garen and other random 5-drops which are not a Screeching Dragon in general, because I will end up with enough Screeching Dragons usually at the end of the draft. On the other hand, our 2-drop slot is not that important. Can play an Accurate Researcher instead, or even an Honored Lord. This isn't really that much of a difference. Similarly, while Rune Dragon card is the best card for our archetype, it isn't really essential, and we could, example, play a Riven instead on turn 3, or even a Loyal Badger Bear. So these two slots are very interchangeable. On turn 5, we always want to play a Screeching Dragon. We want to, already when we start drafting, avoid other 5-cost cards, or other 5-cost units. And actually each, or almost each champion has 1 or 2 cards that are essential for their game plan. Let me give you some examples. Teemo always wants Puffcap Peddlers. It's a good statsed card on its own and very essential for the Puffcap archetype, so you don't want to pick up random Patrol Wardens. LeBlanc wants to have multiple Devouring Glory Seekers. They're also very valuable to level up LeBlanc quickly by dealing 15 damage, and that's why you want to avoid random Crimson Disciples, for example, because your 2-drop slot wants to be 4, 5, 6 Devouring Glory Seekers. Similarly, Lux wants to go Remembrance on turn 3 by banking 2 spell mana. You don't really want to pick up too many random early game units that don't really have synergy with Lux or with your Remembrance. And last example from another region, Leona. Leona always wants to play Ravun on turn 5, because Ravun basically enables the whole Daybreak synergy and makes Leona level up much faster. So we'll spend this Spellercorn, despite being a decent filler card usually, would not be something you want to pick up with Leona. And basically almost every champion has one card that you always want to play with them, and that really goes along to help their strategy and to fulfill that strategy as much as possible. So in your head, go through what will my strategy look like and what cards do I want to always pick, so what cards should I avoid more. And in general, you should draft around one champion strategy, not necessarily the champion alone, but the strategy. For example, dragons, puffcaps, big spells, etc. Because you don't always draw your champion, but you should always have the strategy in place in case you draw your champion, that you can really leverage your champion for the full power. And you should usually go for a 3-to-1 split with your champions. Second champion should then support the first champion. You might be asking now, why not go for a 2-2 split? And let me illustrate this by an example. Let's take the Solar Winds bucket, which combines Leona and Yasuo. And this seems to make a lot of sense at first, because Leona stuns stuff and Yasuo strikes stun stuff. So if you have both of them on the board, then you get to strike a lot and stun a lot and have a lot of synergy. However, in expeditions, you will only get 4 champions at most. And then those 2 champions will be 2 or 4 out of your 36 cards. So drawing both of them at the same time is very unlikely, and your opponent might just have interaction as well. So even if you draw Leona and Yasuo, one of them might just get vengeanced. However, both of those champions want to do different things. Leona wants you to play Daybreak stuff and basically have a good Daybreak curve, whereas Yasuo wants to play stun stuff or recoil stuff. And let's say you build 50-50, 50% Daybreak, 50% stuns. It might just happen that you draw your Leona and all your stun cards, or your Yasuo and all your Daybreak cards, and your deck is just not fulfilling one game plan. And the strongest decks in every format, in Constructed, as well as in Expeditions, are the ones who do one game plan very consistently. Trying to do multiple things usually doesn't work out, because you then have the risk of variance of just drawing the wrong half of your deck, and this not succeeding. Of course, there are cards like Stunhawk who go into both archetypes. Like it's good in Daybreak and good in Stun, but you can't reliably end up with 8 to 10 Solaris Stunhawks. And even then, if you don't draw your champions, you just play a bunch of 2-mana 2/3s. So this is why my tip is to either draft around Leona or around Yasuo, And of course, Yasuo would be good support for Leona. Leona would be good support for Yasuo. But don't go for a 2-2 split, go for a 3-1 split and try to fulfill one strategy over the other. If we move back to our Shyvana example, Shyvana inherently wants to be a mid-range champion. So we want to have our big power spikes at turns 4, 5, 6 when we level up Shyvana, and then close out the game with 7, 8, 9. This is what describes mid-range. And if you look at the different Shyvana pools, it doesn't actually, like, the game plan you have to have in mind doesn't always mean you have to go for the game plan that's intended in the buckets. Oftentimes, the best game plan for champions is a little bit different than what the buckets might suggest you. And the only way you can figure that out is by playing multiple games, by seeing what other people do, and just adapting this strategy. So for example, with Shyvana, we have Dragon's Descent, Malefic Descent, Fist of the Dragon, with Aurelian Soul, Viego, and Lee Sin as the partners. Dragon's Descent, Malefic Descent are mid-range buckets, whereas Fist of the Dragon is a tempo bucket. And the Targon side of Dragons gives you the Fused Firebrand, whereas the Shadow Isles side of Dragons gives you Cameroon Dragon. Now, if you think about what I've talked about before with our game plan, which of these other pairing champions does make sense and which doesn't? Feel free to pause the video and think about it. I will just continue now. So the one that makes sense here is Aurelian Soul. Aurelian Soul is a 10-cost card, so he helps in the late game, something that doesn't really interfere with your usual game plan. And you have the Fused Firebrand, which is, if you don't draw your Screeching Dragon, you can instead play Fused Firebrand on turn 5 and then still level up Shyvana this way. Because Fused Firebrand is worse than Screeching Dragon, but not by much. With the Malefic Descent, I talked about how my 5-cost card of choice would always be Screeching Dragon. So I don't want to cast Viego on turn 5, I don't want to cast Lee Sin on turn 5. If I play Shyvana, I want to cast Screeching Dragon on turn 5. Which would mean that those two 5-cost cards are just not really what I want to be doing usually. And Cameroon Dragon is a 4-cost dragon, and not nearly as strong as the Screeching Dragon, which allows Shyvana a free attack basically. So the challenger. So you would actually interfere with my 4-cost play of Shyvana. And this is the main reason why I don't like drafting either Malefic Descent Viego or Fist of the Dragon Lee Sin together with Shyvana. Because my game plan is I play Shyvana, I play Screeching Dragon. And not Shyvana Viego, not Shyvana Lee Sin. Both of these game plans sound weaker, so I don't want to go for them. Instead, I want to either go for Targon or look for one of the other mid-range regions. Noxus, Monodemacia, even Freljord, Shurima, or Bandle City are all good pairings with Shyvana, just so you can fill out your curve a little bit and basically have your game plan Shyvana, Screeching Dragon, and then the rest can be a little bit more flexible. Good partners for Shyvana would, for example, be Riven first of all. Riven just would replace our Ruined Dragon Guard and be a better 3-drop in that, by giving us this Blade Fragment. If you pass turn 1, you can immediately give a Shyvana quick attack, for example, or +2/+0, and get an even stronger attack this way. Taric would be a good replacement for Shyvana. You still would like to go turn 4 Screeching Dragon, or turn 5 Screeching Dragon. If you play Taric on turn 4, have some mana banked up, that can be even more helpful with Screeching Dragon, because the Screeching Dragon can challenge away the unit that would kill our Taric, while Taric buffs up Screeching Dragon, and it all just really works out. Same can be said with our Jarvan. If our game plan is Shyvana into Screeching Dragon, then on turn 6 we can play the open attack. If we attack on turn 4 with Shyvana, turn 5 we play Screeching Dragon, turn 6 we open attack, challenge one of our opponent's units, Jarvan challenges another one, and our Shyvana still levels up. So these fit into our actual game plan of turn 5 Screeching Dragon and don't interfere with it at all. Some bad partners would be Azir, Poppy, or Gangplank. Azir is just something completely different. Azir wants to be a fast combo deck, and in our deck it would just be a 1/5, which doesn't even block that well and usually just does nothing. And the Sand Soldiers don't have any synergy with our dragon strategy. Poppy is still a good card, but I don't want Poppy in a dragon deck. She would be better in a swarm deck. Because if you think about it, if you visualize our curve we had before, actually go back to it, and here, if we instead of playing Shyvana, play Poppy, and then play Screeching Dragon, Poppy doesn't actually buff up anything. All of our units in our intended curve have 3 attack or 4 attack. And this makes Poppy not really that synergetic or not really that helpful in our current archetype or our current game plan. So I wouldn't usually draft Poppy with Shyvana. Gangplank might be the same archetype as a 5-cost mid-range card, but he is in Bilgewater, not a region I really want, since I'm wanting to draft good steady units and mostly Demacia. And he's also a 5-drop, so he would once again interfere with our game plan, Shyvana Screeching Dragon. So that's something you have to keep in mind while drafting. Next step, if you found your game plan, of course this game plan is different for each champion. I showed you some examples, but I can't go over every champion. If you want to learn more about the game plans of champions, you can watch my series where I talk about all the champions or the earlier videos. But once you figured out the game plan for your champion, you want to adjust your curve and spells to your game plan. You want to have your strongest point in the middle of the game, like in our Screeching Dragon. You want to have a lot of Screeching Dragons in our deck, like 6, 7, 8. And Shyvana on 4, so that's why we want to have a curve to be more mid-rangey. So instead of having 7 2-drops, we might have just 4 2-drops and instead 7 5-drops. Similarly, if you want to go aggressive, you want to have a cheaper curve. More 1-drops, more 2-drops, more 3-drops. If you want to be a combo deck, you have to basically disregard curve a little bit and think about how can I play my combo very efficiently. If you want to be a control deck, you have to think about how can I use my spells efficiently and control the board this way. So you always have to adjust your curve and spells to your game plan. And this is where my advanced tier list or my advanced not tier list curve I use on my screen comes into play. As you see on the top, this is something I've shown in the beginner guide. Just keep track of how many 1-drops, 2-drops, 3-drops, 4-drops, 5-drops, etc. Just the units on the top slot. And in the bottom side, I track which spells I have or which unique effects I have. Not only spells, but unique effects. And I first want to go over all of these. Of course, you can use a different way of tracking. You don't necessarily have to have it as detailed as I do. But I really like to know which effects I have in my deck so that I don't have too many of the same effect. Let's start with combat tricks. Combat tricks are cards that affect combat situations in your favor. And these numbers in the parentheses tell you how many I actually want in my deck of this. So in the usual deck, I want 3 to 7 combat tricks. This includes cards like Sharpened Resolve, just straight up buff spells, also cards like Syncopation with stopping allies, and also Frostbites, because Frostbites usually are used to affect combat situations. A 3-3 blocks a 3-3, you Frostbite it. So this counts as a combat trick for me. Slow buffs are cards that take up an action without developing a unit, buffing a unit. The main one would be Zenith Blade. Others include like Battlefield Prowess, for example. This is a little bit rarer, but I wanted to have this tracked as well. And I don't really like Zenith Blade as a card that much. It's fine, but in the usual deck I want 0 to 2 slow buffs. Just because if your opponent develops, you just buff your own unit, then you have one big unit, your opponent has 3 small units, and then you take a lot of damage, because going wide is usually better than going tall in Legends of Runeterra. Group buffs are buffs that buff your whole board, like it says, and you need to go wide for them to be good. Yordles and Arms for Demacia. Of course, if you're a swarm deck in Bandle City, you want to have multiple Yordles and Arms, but on average, I want 0 to 2 of these whole board buffs in my deck. Small removal destroys small units, as the name says, so I want 2 to 7 of those. Prime examples would be Death Ray, Mystic Shot, Black Spear. Basically anything that deals 5 or less damage is small removal for me. AoE, Area of Effect, is better known as board vibes in the card game scene, but this didn't actually fit into my little graphics, so I just called it AoE. And this hits multiple units at once. The obvious examples would be Avalanche, Static Shock, but also Judgment. Judgment is a card that counts as a AoE spell. it just deals with multiple units at once. I usually want 1 to 3 of this effect, because those cards are usually a little bit less efficient than just having a Mystic Shot in my deck and hit more specific situations. Hard removal can destroy almost everything. Examples would be Scorched Earth, Sunburst, and Vengeance. Sunburst deals 6 damage. There are very, very little units in this game that have more than 6 health. So this is my breakpoint. If a card deals 6 or more damage, it's hard removal. If a card deals 5 or less damage, it's small removal. And yeah, I usually want 2 to 6, depending on my deck, of course. A Strike and Fight spell involves your units for destroying enemies. This includes single combat, Whirling Death, just the standard strike cards, but also cards that give Challenger vulnerable, or Cataclysm, for example. Because those vulnerable effects only do something if you have a unit on the board that can kill your opponent and actually get it into combat. And it really depends with these strike and fight effects how good your units are and how many units you have. If you just have 15 units in your deck, those strike and fight cards won't be that good. So in my average deck, I want 0 to 6 of these effects. And then you have a little bit more specific effects. Recall is, of course, recall a unit, which is a pure tempo play. We have Recall and Will of Ionia, but also Keeper's Verdict. Keeper's Verdict is basically a Will of Ionia, but instead of putting it into your opponent's hand, it puts it on top. So I also count it as a recall. But because it's purely tempo, I usually want 0 to 3, so not too many of these recall effects in my deck. Tempo for Stun, also a pure tempo play. The main examples would be Steel Tempest, Concussive Palm, and now also Event Horizon, which I usually also want 0 to 2 in my deck. Don't really like the stun effects, don't think they're very powerful in expeditions. Counters counter your opponent's spells skills. There are Notify, Deny, and Rite of Negation. Unlike Constructed, your opponent isn't necessarily going to play skills and spells, so in my expedition decks I just don't want to have these effects. I still want to know if I have any one of those in my deck already, because the second Deny, second Notify is way, way worse than the first Notify and first Deny. Invokes give you a selection of random cards. This is the classical Invoke, like Behold Infinite, but also cards like Gifts from Beyond and Scrap Heap. Those cards also sacrifice 1 mana to give you a wider selection of cards to choose from, and usually I want 0 to 6. Some decks that want to be very proactive don't want these invokes. For example, if you play a Noxus aggro deck, you don't want to invoke, you don't want to do random cycling stuff. However, in a, for example, Zoe deck, where you want to have created cards, invokes get really good, and I want to have 6, 7, 8 just cards that create other cards. For example, Victor as well would be good with invokes. Draw is what the name says, just gets you card advantage. Glimpse Beyond, Whispered Words, Progress Ray, draw 3, draw 2, draw 2. And you don't really want too many draw effects because they don't affect the board at all. If you just play draw, then you will have no board and your opponent will just hit you. So I usually aim for 1 to 3 draw effects in my deck. Next up we have rallies that allow you to attack multiple times. Best ones are Demacia, Golden Aegis, and Relentless Pursuit. But there also are other rally effects in other regions, for example, Playful Trickster in Bilgewater. And in usual deck, I aim for 0 to 1. In some cases, I like 2, if I'm like really aggressive, really on the board. But the second rally effect is already lower value than the first one, because they always win more effects. They're only good if you like are ahead and your second attack does something for you, and really bad if you are behind. I'm not a really big fan of rally effects. Then we have finishers, just big spells that help you close out the game. Examples would be Atrocity and Harrowing. Atrocity shouldn't really be used as a removal spell, just a finisher. And another example would be Decimate. Decimate doesn't really exist in expeditions right now, but it's still a card that I would classify as a finisher spell. You usually don't want to have more than one finisher. Most decks don't really need those finishers. With Atrocity, for example, if you're 10-10 on the board, you might already win. You don't need to fling the opponent's nexus. So I also like to go for 0 to 2. And then we have support, the filler category for spells and effects that don't really fit into any other of the foremost mentioned ones, like Mushroom Cloud and Additive Improvement. And I generally don't want to have any filler cards in my deck, so I also aim for 0 to 2 in the support category. There are also cards that have similar effects. For example, Nile Priestess basically counts as an invoke, Spirit Leech counts as a draw, and Decisive Tactician counts as a rally. So if you want to really try hard, you should also keep track of how many of these effects you have in your deck. I oftentimes am a little bit too lazy for that, which is a little bit unfortunate, but I sometimes just forget adding those as a draw effect, for example, because it's just counted as a 4-drop. And if you want to really try to win your expedition run, or if you want to build a constructed deck, you should also look at this. If you have already 3 copies of Spirit Leech in your deck, then you probably don't need any more card draw effects. If you have already run triple Nile Priestess, you don't usually need more invoke effects in your deck. So if you build a constructed deck, you should definitely look how many of these unique effects you have and try to not end up with 10 rally effects, for example. 2 to 5 would be usually good in a constructed deck. And the reason I want to diversify these options and cards is because actually in Runeterra, this is an awesome game because everything can be countered by something else. A strike effect gets countered by frostbites. A rally effect gets countered by stuns. And a hard removal spell can get countered by denies, or just counter magic, or just small units, for example. So for each effect in your deck, there is a counter effect. So if you just end up with 10 strike cards, then you will have a bad matchup against the frostbite deck. Instead, if you have like 5 strike cards and 5 vengeances, then it's a little bit more split up and you don't get countered by a single strategy that much. Let's go back to our Shyvana deck from the example. Our Shyvana deck, our game plan is we want to play big units, we want to be ahead on the board, and we want to go into combat often, since Shyvana does something when she attacks. Our Screeching Dragons want to battle, challenge units. So what effects are we looking for in our Shyvana deck? We want strike and fight effects, since we have big units. We want rally effects, since we are ahead on the board, and we want to leverage that lead into a win. And we want combat tricks, since we are in combat very often. The perfect card for our deck would be Judgment, just a way to clear the whole board and basically kill everything while leveraging our big units. Let's take another strategy into example and say we want to build around Elise and the Spider archetype. As a Spider archetype, we will mostly have small units. We will oftentimes be also ahead on the board, but we want to end the game quickly. We don't really want to sit around, go to the late game and outvalue opponents. We want to have a big board and then translate that board into a win. So what effects do we looking for here? First one would be hard removal and stuns. A strike and fight card would be pretty bad because we just have a bunch of tiny spiderlings who can't really fight anything. However, if your opponent taps out for a 6-cost spell, 7-cost spell, or unit, and you just get to vengeance it, then have your whole spiderlings attack again, or even just stun this unit, that's very powerful. You also want combat tricks because you want to go into combat a lot with your spiders, and group buffs would be more valuable for your deck, since you will have multiple units, not just 1 or 2 big ones. Best card in your deck would probably be Decisive Maneuvers. It stuns the opponent's expensive spell and buffs them all of your units, giving you a big way to close out the game. As a third example, let's look at Anivia. Anivia will oftentimes have big units as well, like Yetis for example, but not that many. And Anivia decks tend to fall behind on the board. They don't have this amazing curve out strategy, a little bit more control-ish, maybe ramp stuff. So they fall behind on the board, but they win the long game. With cards like Anivia, doesn't really matter how far behind the card advantage you are, you will win with your Anivia and dealing 2 damage to everything. So since they are behind on the board and they have mostly big units, they want to look for AoE and small removal. And it's always a system. If you have big units, you want small removal. If you have small units, you want hard removal or stun effects. Because you want to differentiate. If you have big stuff, I will kill your opponent's big stuff, but I have trouble against swarm decks. You want to have small removal and AoE. If you have small stuff, you won't have any problem against other small stuff, but the big stuff can block you over and over again, so it's nice to have a way to take it out. Also in Anivia, I usually look for stuns or recalls. Because we always win the long game, it's actually fine to go down in card advantage a little bit to temporarily delay your opponents. Because just delaying my opponent 1 or 2 turns might be enough to get to turn 10 and get my big Anivia payoff. And I also look for draws and invokes. Since I'm a little bit of a slower deck, I want to find more answers and want to have cards that like adapt to the situation and don't always just do the same. The best card for Anivia would be the Ruination. We are behind on the board, and this allows us to completely reset the board for a turn and basically get one turn closer to our Anivia level up. Note that I've said all of these cards are very good. Like Shyvana loves Judgment, Elise loves Decisive Maneuvers, Anivia loves Ruination, but we can't really change those effects around. A Judgment would be pretty bad in Elise and would do almost nothing against Anivia. For example, if you play Judgment on Elise, your opponent might just play a Get Excited and kill your unit, whereas they can't easily kill your 6-7 Screeching Dragon, for example. Decisive Maneuvers would be pretty bad in Shyvana, since it would only buff up 2 or 3 units instead of a full 6-unit board, usually on turn 5. Similarly, the Ruination would be kinda bad in the other two, since you want to be ahead on the board. If you lost the board, and it goes to the late game where you can cast Ruination, you usually have lost anyways. Like if you play a Spider deck and have a Ruination tech in your deck, you might kill your opponent's stuff for one turn. Then you still have a bunch of little Spiderlings, and while your opponent plays a bunch of big dragons. So this is the problem in tier lists, because a tier list would just say you Judgment is a good card, Decisive Maneuvers is a bad card. But that doesn't really hold true most of the time, and you have to actually use your brain, think about your game plan, and think about what kind of effects you want in your game plan and what kind of effects work in your situation. Let's move on to the experts. So if you have like played 500 expeditions and have an understanding of all the archetypes, what all the champions want to do and the pairings, and I would really suggest to you, don't worry about buckets at all for now, if you're just like a little bit beginner of expeditions. But I also want to showcase you, or anybody who really wants to prove in expeditions, what I do differently to other drafters, or the average drafter, for example, and what my strategy is. And the first one I do is to figure out the best strategy in the format. Once you've played 500 expedition games, you will be like, oh my god, I always lose to dragons, that's so overpowered. Or this darkness strategy is so strong, and nothing can beat that. And then you figure out this strategy or these strategies are the best in the format. Constructed, that's even easier. You can just look at a tier list and look at what deck beats most of the other decks. And then you want to either adapt the strategy or counter it. Let's take a look at adapting the strategy first. Let's say we figured out over hundreds of expedition games and looking at statistics that this dragon archetype and the dragon curve is the best one we can possibly get and has the highest win rate possible. Like a researcher, Rune Dragon Guard, Shyvana, Screeching Dragon. Then you take this game plan and you think about what other game plan beats this game plan. Or how can I make my game plan that looks the same better than my opponent just doing the same? Because you just play the same units, it just kinda comes down to a coin flip. Who draws better and who's on the attack token in the right turn you don't really get an advantage out of that. But for example, a change you can make, you can, instead of playing your Accurate Researcher, bank 2 spell mana on turn 2, and then take in Single Combat and Sharpsight, which are of course already good cards, but you would then not play in a 2-drop on turn 2, or not even pick up too many 2-drops, so that if you attack on turn 4, Shyvana turns into a 4-5, and then you can Single Combat down your opponent's Shyvana. Or their Shyvana attacks you, and then you Sharpsight your Shyvana and block her, and you won this game on the spot basically, because your opponent lost their key strategy piece, while yours is even closer to leveling up. Your opponent, in turn, might then not play Dragon Shout turn 1 and not play Rune Dragon Guard and bank 3 spell mana to counter your interaction with Prismatic Barrier. And this is how constructed metas develop. Someone figures out the strongest strategy, and then other people think about how can I counter this strategy, what is good against this game plan, and it actually works similarly in expeditions. For example, in expeditions, if you want to counter this, not just adapt it, just counter it, a good way to counter dragons is LeBlanc. A typical LeBlanc draw would be Legion Rearguard into Deferring Glory Seeker, into LeBlanc, into Legion Drummer, Deferring Glory Seeker, and then maybe a Whirling Death. And the average dragon draw just doesn't beat this at all, because your Screeching Dragon will just get quick attack challenged, while the Shyvana gets quick attack challenged, and you basically have nothing on the board while a gigantic LeBlanc kills you over and over, and not even a single combat would save you from LeBlanc because your unit still dies. So LeBlanc typically very good at countering the Dragon archetype. Of course, the Dragon player may now adapt as well. If they would see a lot of this LeBlanc, they might instead play a Silverwing Vanguard, a card that can take down both the Faring Glory Seekers, or play a Fleet Feather Tracker. And this is some way you can adapt the best strategy. If you think about, this strategy is the best, how can I make it even better so that I don't get countered anymore? Another example of a strategy that counters Shyvana would be Lux currently. So Lux is a mid-range slayer, as I call it, because Lux wants to bank mana turn 1, bank mana turn 2, and then play a Remembrance on turn 3, which oftentimes results in a Screeching Dragon or a Creator Companion. There are 4 possible outcomes. This is like then a 50-50. And if your opponent just plays a Rune Dragon Guard and Accurate Researcher, they take 10 damage or have to lose both of their units to this Creator Companion. Or they just straight up lose the Rune Dragon Guard or even the Shyvana on your attack or can't play Shyvana. And this is why turn 3 Remembrance is quite strong versus Shyvana. Then if you follow it up with Mage Seeker Persuader on turn 2 or turn 4 and bank 2 spell mana, and turn 5 you play your Lux, which invalidates their Dragon attack because Shyvana hitting a barrier doesn't give a level up because he doesn't actually do damage. And then you also have a single combat to have your big guy fight the Shyvana or Screeching Dragon. That will almost always win you the game. So you take a look at the strongest strategy and then you theory craft which other strategy, which other lineup can be able to beat this strongest strategy. If it would be the way that no possible play would be able to beat the strongest strategy, that would be overpowered and of course very unfun and would need to be nerfed. But right now, for each strategy, especially in expeditions, there is a counter strategy available. Something that can really beat this top strategy. If you can't find it out on your own, you can also go to like Discords or gaming communities, Reddit, and just say, I keep losing to Shyvana dragons. What strategy is possible, or what strategy beats dragons? People might tell you LeBlanc, they might tell you Lux, and others are like Teemo, just a very fast combo deck. Veiga I like, Kindred, Anivia, all of these champions are, in my opinion, favored against the classical dragon archetype. And I am one that usually tries to counter the main deck instead of adapting it, because I hate being countered myself, and I hate being transparent to my opponent. My opponent sees Shyvana, they've played against it 1,000 times before, and are like, okay, they will go this, how can I adapt to that? Like everybody will know that if this is the best strategy. Even worse players will know what the best deck does in the format. As if you play a little bit of an off-meta list, like Lux or maybe Darkness, then your opponent might be a little bit more surprised sometimes, or don't know exactly what your deck is doing, and you have the chance to actually counter the top deck. But there are 2 things you have to keep in mind. When playing the best strategy, you have to make sure to play that strategy reliably. So you have to always be able to get your perfect curve. You have to still do your strategy. An example I saw was when Draven Zion was pretty good, and they were running Scorched Earth, like as a 1 of 2 or something, and then the random people just decided to play Noxian Guillotine instead. Noxian Guillotine might seem like an upgrade to Scorched Earth, but otherwise around, it would make you weak to Banditry, a deck you should usually never lose to as Draven Zion back in the day. So swapping out Scorched Earth for Noxian Guillotine while making it better for you to beat other matchups makes the main matchups you beat worse. And usually you should just accept that you lose some matchups and instead try to win those matchups. For example, right now in Constructed I play Darkness. Darkness is like 70% against TF Nami and 50-50 versus Ken and Ari. And it only has 35% against Pantheon. So I could like take my deck more against Pantheon, but that would mean I don't win 70% of the time versus TF Nami. And it's better to just accept the loss versus Pantheon, take the win versus TF Nami, and then battle it out versus the Ken and Ari decks. So you don't want to adapt your strategy too much, otherwise it won't be the best strategy anymore, just a random assumption of cards. And when countering, you have to make sure that your deck can win against other decks as well. You don't want to just win against the best strategy, you want to be able to win against other strategies as well. And this was actually the problem with Azir Aurelia back then. You could play Dragons, you could play Thresh Narcissus, but basically Thresh Narcissus was the only deck that could also win against other decks. There were multiple other cards like the Scargrounds, for example, but the Scargrounds couldn't just win, or Vladimir couldn't just win against any other deck in the format. That's also bad, because you won't just always face the same deck, you will have to beat multiple decks. For example, if you wanted to just try to counter Dragons, a deck with 15 Despair would be pretty good. But because you won't always just face Dragons, a deck with 15 Despair would make you very weak against any aggressive deck, because you just don't have the life total to play 15 Despair in a game. Okay, so now you might be thinking and might be like, hey Conan, how does any of this make sense? Isn't Expeditions fully random? How can I get certain cards I want? And to that, I want to respond that Expeditions is not fully random, and you can actually reliably get the cards you're looking for by a method I call bucket shaping, which will be explained in the next video. Didn't want to make this one too long, so thank you for watching for now, and check out the other video. I hope you learned something, and see you maybe in the Discord or just in general.